Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining our session on stakeholder engagement towards freight decarbonisation. I'm going to start to screen share briefly, but we won't wait too long before getting into the meat of the workshop. We'll just do a brief introduction to some of the issues and practicalities. Then later on, we'll tell you a bit more about the projects we've been working on that led into this workshop. Okay. Okay, so if colleagues could nod to show that they can see the screen, that would be helpful.
Yes, all good.
Yeah, oh good, thank you. So I'll shortly introduce the research team and the event, but briefly just asked you to run through from some housekeeping. Please, could you mute your microphone unless you're speaking? We'll all no doubt do the other thing when you're speaking and forget to unmute, and advise each other politely. Use the chat facility to ask questions or make comments whenever you want to. You can also send a private chat message to Firefly if you need technical support, or to Tina and Shona if you need help with anything else. The meeting is being recorded. Can we check the recording's on? Who's pressing that?
Yes,
it's on. Thank you. And to try to give this a bit more of a feel of a face-to-face event, please consider closing any other programs and windows you might have got open and mute all your other devices. It says here rather amusingly, we can give you permission to be present and free of distractions for the duration of this session. So yeah. We're all empowered now. So before we go any further, we do just need, because we are going to be using the outcome of the workshop to inform our research, we do just need to check that we have your consent to take part. So there is an online consent form, and Daniela will post a link to that. It takes you through to a very brief survey form in which you can confirm your consent, and we need that before we move over to the Miro. Before we go any further, does anybody have any questions about issues of consent and confidentiality that we need to pick up? Look at the chat. Okay, I'm going to take silence as consent then, but assuming that anybody who hasn't yet could fill in that consent form on the link provided by Daniela. And Daniela, you'll probably need to repost it every now and again, because I think some people may join and won't see the previous chat. Okay. So briefly then, just going to introduce the broad aim of the two projects and the afternoon. So our whole work was around stakeholder engagement towards freight decarbonisation, and we're actually talking about two projects today, or drawing on the work of two projects. One was indeed funded by Decarbonate and is called CODEZERO, and looks specifically at freight decarbonisation in urban areas and with a focus on the north of England. And the other one was called CRAFTeD, funded by a sister network to Decarbonate, decarbonising UK freight transport. And this focused on a regional perspective and had a particular focus in the southwest of England. As I say, we will tell you more about these projects later on. But we wanted to show you briefly the agenda. So we're going to after this brief introduction, we're going to go to a ice-breaking activity in the Miro platform. Don't worry if you haven't used that before, although I guess many of you will have done, but there will be a brief essentials training for anybody who needs it. We're then going to have a plenary discussion to get your first thoughts around how we can involve consumers. That's our particular focus today, how we can promote sustainable consumerism. And this will be a plenary based on that ice-breaking activity. Then there'll be a comfort break for about 10 minutes. Then we're going to go to breakout 1, focusing in on some of the practical things that could be done for working with citizens around this topic. There'll be a plenary based on that, and then we're going to share the results of our projects. Another comfort break, then we come back for breakout session 2, which will be focusing more around quick wins, very much in the spirit of the conference. What can we get on and do? Who needs to be involved in doing that in order to drive this agenda forward rapidly? Then we'll come back for a final plenary, and then there will be a networking session, which will be of a more optional nature. Those of you who want to stay around are very welcome to do that, with a formal end when the platform closes at 6 o'clock. Okay, so I'll just briefly extend the introduction by saying that we've already spoken in both projects with several groups of stakeholders of different kinds. We've gone through various exercises, a little bit like this, but with different foci and perspectives examined, but all focusing on this issue of decarbonising in the freight sector. We've obviously done literature reviews as well and had wider conversations with specific actors and groups of key actors. So what we've been aiming to do is really develop what might be called a route map, or a series of pathways that can be followed in order to reach the ultimate goal, and understanding the roles of the different actors and organisations, the role of government, and what regulations and incentives will be needed to take us towards that final destination of a net zero outcome. We've had to address uncertainties about technology, organisational change, and the policy context. But one of the things that we particularly found that was lacking was a citizen focus in our perspective. We did attempt to contact citizen representatives and citizen groups, but actually it was even quite hard to get all professionals relevant for this topic involved in the work. So we thought it would be really good at this conference to try to address the citizen perspective, and we could do that because we're all citizens to some extent. Well, we're all citizens, but we're all thinking also in the modality of being consumers as well as being academics, practitioners, or from other walks of life. And that enables us to consider directly this perspective, but also we wanted to consider what professionals can do to encourage citizens to consider the implications of their consumption for freight mobility and its carbon emissions. Right, so as we said right at the beginning, the work that sort of stimulated this workshop comes out of 2 projects. Briefly, just to re-summarise, we had the CRAFTeD project, which was funded by the Decarbonising UK Freight Transport network. That's a sister network to Decarbonate, focused on freight, of course. And we've all worked on that together, Daniela, myself, Jez, Neil, and also Professor Colin Taylor. And that was a medium-scale project lasting 6 months, and it looked across the different freight sectors mainly in the southwest of England, but we did also hold a workshop joint with CODEZERO in the north of England to get another regional perspective. But it was focusing on the regional context to decarbonisation. And then CODEZERO was a smaller project funded through Decarbonate directly, and that had an urban freight focus in the north of England. And Daniela was the researcher, the lead researcher and the researcher on that, but we did give her some support, including through some joint workshops. So we collaborated ourselves on this, and one of the themes we looked at was indeed collaborative solutions and co-design, how we could actually work with stakeholders to develop solutions in this area, and we're continuing that process with this workshop today. Understanding stakeholder perspectives and moving towards some kind of route map, although we put that word in inverted commas because a route map suggests you know exactly the route you're going to take, whereas one of our key lessons would be actually you need to have flexibility, you need to have pathway options, and you need to be dynamic about the route that you need to take along the way. But hopefully at least you're getting to that right destination. So taking the two projects together, some of the key questions we were looking at are what are the kinds of methods and tools that could most effectively support decisions. And we were focused on the UK freight system, but recognizing it has multiple scales, so geographical scales in terms of local, regional, national, but also particularly for extensive international supply chains, often some of those decisions are beyond the scope of UK governance on its own and belong in the domain of major international businesses or indeed international organisations and governance organisations. We were particularly keen to see how we could get a full diversity of freight stakeholders, and that was intended to include consumers themselves, although we have struggled a bit to engage consumers directly on this issue, hence the focus today. How could we get them to contribute to the discussion and understand what their relationship is to the freight system in terms of their contribution to demand and potential changes they could make in the way it's organised? We were interested in what the best spatial level is, and we started with the kind of hypothesis that the regional level had something to offer. I'll come back to that a bit later on, or Daniela will, I think, with some conclusions. And some tensions around barriers to decarbonisation and trade-offs. We wanted to uncover those and how they might be overcome. Maybe I should have put that last point in red, not the barriers. It's easy to identify the problems, much harder to reach the solutions. And indeed, considering those solutions, what's the right balance between technology and behaviour change? This is a dichotomy that's being worked out across the whole policy arena for decarbonisation, but a particularly tight one perhaps in freight transport, where technological solutions exist in some parts of the system, but not all of them. A reminder of the importance of the problem we are facing. Freight is a third of UK transport greenhouse gas emissions, and potentially that is a growing share. And transport, of course, is now, for the UK, the biggest contributor to our national emissions inventory, particularly true of some developed states. The industrializing states around the world still have a somewhat different position, but for us, transport is 28% of emissions. Light van traffic is one that's been seen as particularly growing. It's doubled in recent times and is predicted to grow again, potentially doubling by 2050 if policy doesn't intervene to address those forecasts based on essentially business as usual with some tweaks. Heavy goods vehicles have been a bit more stable in demand, but obviously a major contributor due to the consumption of those vehicles and the distance travelled. A word on our approach. We were very much taking a social sciences, humanities-led approach in trying to take a critical realist perspective and developing learning journeys with our participants. So essentially the perspective holds that there is a real world out there with real consequences. So decisions do result in observable change in the actual world and how it's experienced. But we cannot directly address those. In our perceptions, we see a version of that reality. We may not share those perceptions. So part of our process here, working with stakeholders, is to achieve a shared perspective on the issues. And the central layer there of this diagram is identifying how digital twins processes can be used to capture that shared information, share in a representation of the world what we can agree about the reality and what can be changed. So that's the basis that we are coming from, and hopefully taking people through a learning journey. A key finding was that this wasn't a decide, fix and forget kind of problem area. This is something that's going to take decades and maybe indeed involving generations of practitioners and citizens working together. And I think it's my last slide. I've already mentioned that point about the growing traffic. So you've got a graphical version of that there. Vehicles going up, traffic perhaps a bit more stable, but that context, and some views there from business around what drives their next van purchase. And still, of course, businesses need to stay in business. They need to be financially sustainable. So purchase costs, etc., are still topping that table. Some of the environmental factors beginning to become more important. Be interesting to look at this now. Clean air zones are beginning to happen, and recognizing the synergies there with other policy domains. Okay, and then lastly, actually, of course, we talk a lot about vans, but it's an often overlooked point that not all of them are carrying goods to people's doorsteps. That is a fairly small part of the total demand. A lot of it is about small businesses moving their own equipment around to provide services, perhaps working on construction sites, etc. So it is an important but small part of that pie. Okay, I'm now handing over to Daniela, who's going to talk through some of the practical side of the project. And I guess I'm going to continue to screen share, and she's going to tell me when to move on.
Yes, thank you very much. That will be great.
Sorry, Graham, just checking on those van stats. Were they all from the same document?
These come from DFT statistics, I think.
There's the link.
Yeah,
that link. So that link is for all three of the graphs that you got there. Okay, that's interesting, because it's been traditionally really painful to get details of van usage, because you have to basically do roadside pullovers to actually get people to get the detail. And considering only 4% is providing transport for others, I do wonder what's happening in terms of things like movement of food, because a lot of the more sustainable organic food is moving in vans rather than in the big vehicles. However, the thing that just worth flagging, sorry, there's a plane going over at the time, is the second-hand market for vans.
Yes.
There is a really long tail of second-hand market, and it's the same with certain categories of HGVs, so things like removal vehicles and things like cement mixers. The more specialist the vehicle is, the longer it tends to stay in the fleet. Second-hand vans are forever being, passed on. So that's a concern just on decarbonisation, because nobody's buying new, and it's what the resale value may be.
No, very good point. And obviously those are major assets for a small business to replace. Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I think this comes from one of those statistics leaflets that DFT produces. Okay, great. Daniela.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so in both projects we used Miro or Miro. You already know what it is now. It's an online whiteboard. Next slide, please. So these are just some examples of what we've been doing We've been designing different activities. As you can see, stakeholders use sticky notes, very similarly to what you've done, to write comments and address specific issues. We also asked them to think of the impact of each solution on freight decarbonization, and also the likelihood of for each solution to be implemented in the next 20 to 30 years. This gave us an idea about what kind of solutions could contribute more to freight decarbonization, and therefore where policymakers should put more attention. Next slide, please. So we identified some key uncertainties in terms of major uncertainties regarding the transition to freight decarbonization. Stakeholders identified technical uncertainties. So for example, about what kind of method could be more efficient or available to decarbonize freight, what energy requirements and future availability of energy in the UK. So would we need to import electricity or hydrogen or other clean fuels? We would then also need to design and establish the required infrastructure, which is missing. There were uncertainties related to cost efficiency of new fuels compared to diesel as well. Then policy and financial uncertainties about who is going to pay for the new vehicles and the infrastructure, and how the policy framework is going to be designed. And finally, there were uncertainties related to organizational and behavioral issues, especially because collaborative schemes might be a very good solution or key solution in urban freight decarbonization especially, but stakeholders might not be willing to share information and resources and or facilities with competitors. Next slide, please. So stakeholders' knowledge towards freight decarbonization was very varied. Some stakeholders attended because they wanted to learn more about the topic, so they expected actually from us to have the solution. We found that hydrogen is currently favored over electrification for road freight and in the middle to long term, whereas compressed natural gas and liquefied natural gas are seen as a short or immediate clean solution. In addition to technical feasibility, energy and fuel supply is important to achieve decarbonization. We couldn't find existing solutions other than offsetting for air freight. There was some debate towards achieving further efficiency savings from vehicle design or collaboration, for example. And then very interestingly, automation was seen as not very important in terms of decarbonization. So they told us they think it's going to help to make the transport system more efficient, but not more sustainable or not to decarbonize the transport system. Next slide, please. So looking at the urban freight system, we grouped solutions that stakeholders identified within the two projects into 4 main clusters. This is the first cluster, and it includes micro-mobility with e-cargo bikes and porters and micro-consolidation centers. We can have reduced congestion and carbon emissions due to urban freight movements due to a combined effect of consolidation and use of low zero emission solutions for the last mile. On the other hand, the limited size of e-cargo bikes might be a limitation in terms of carrying capacity and can therefore have a negative impact on cost efficiency. So this might be a potential issue to establish a business case. Another main barrier related to urban consolidation is related to collaboration among stakeholders, as some brands might take a commercial advantage. So logistics operators like to have their brand recognized in urban areas, especially by retailers and then consumers. In addition, there might be potentially added costs and higher disruption due to the additional node, to the added node. I leave you with a key question from stakeholders about this cluster of solutions. So they asked us, big logistics operators already consolidate at a very optimal level. Are we sure this is going to be a commercially, operationally viable option? Next slide, please. The second cluster of solution is represented by rapid rail logistics with shared passengers freight trains used to move goods between hubs, and then using micromobility or e-vans for the very last mile. This is similar in some sense to the previous cluster, as we're still considering hubs. In that case, it was the consolidation center. But in this case, they suggested to use rather the station as a hub, where to start the very final mile of the chain. This solution was quite popular in the north due to the proximity of big cities such as Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, and Sheffield. And we could consider these cities as part of a macro urban system where goods are moved by rapid transit rail systems in between cities using railway stations as a network of hubs that is then connected to other sustainable solutions such as micromobility for the very last mile. In this case, the main drivers are a significant reduction of AGVs and LGVs due to the shift to rail and related carbon emission reduction. Also, if home working is going to be a trend in the future, it would be useful to rethink how to use the unused capacity of trains and stations due to less people commuting. However, some interventions would be required to enlarge the space in the railway stations to convert or adapt them to urban freight hubs. This means that we will need bigger logistics land availability as well, and new or different land use regulations. A key point from stakeholders about this cluster was that rail freight could be used as a priority or more convenient option to deliver high volumes of construction materials into urban centers. Next slide, please. The third cluster is related to electrification and new fuels, including biogases, LNG, and hydrogen. So similarly to the previous case, we would have a reduction in carbon and polluting emissions, but not in congestion. So be aware of that. This cluster would require the government to provide financial support or subsidies to companies for them to switch to a new electric fleet. On the other hand, this solution would require investment in infrastructures and energy supply availability. Also, AGVs are at the moment more problematic to decarbonize, especially due to the bigger size of the battery that would reduce the load capacity of the vehicles. So electric vans are quite well performing now, so that would be like a short-term option. A key question about this cluster from our stakeholders was, is electric the only net zero solution for an urban environment? Can compressed natural gas or liquefied natural gas have a role given that the goal is net zero, not absolute zero? Next slide, please. The final cluster is related to collective and collaborative procurement and collaborative schemes in general to maximize the efficiency of systems while reducing carbon emissions. So the drivers to implement this solution would be a more optimized system with a reduction of demand for loading and unloading space, a more sized service where it is possible to achieve economy of scale. However, this might be the most difficult solution to implement, as stakeholders are usually not willing to collaborate due to competitiveness, and it might be even harder for new, smaller players to enter the market, creating therefore inequalities. A key question about this cluster was, what if some players gain a greater advantage than others? Next slide, please. Okay, so it was quite hard to define a route map, as Graham said, for the regional environment. We tried to do it for the urban environment with CODEZERO, even though there are high uncertainties, especially towards technologies and energy. Here you can see a summary of the main solutions for urban freight that stakeholders identified. It was interesting to see that stakeholders see new technologies such as automation and drones as additional solutions that are not key for the decarbonization of urban freight, but could anyway be included to improve the overall efficiency of the urban system and reduce costs. Click. If you click, there should be some more solutions there. Yeah. So you can see the new technologies here. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we expect the technological solutions to play a big role in freight decarbonization, but we found that organizational and behavioral solutions are indeed key components of freight decarbonization. Sometimes they're even more important. Achieving freight sector decarbonization is possible, but requires total focus from the individual citizen consumer decision through a national carbon budgeting. In terms of stakeholders, we believe that it is important to reduce the risk of investment in newer, cleaner technologies in order to encourage them to commit to decarbonization. Also, in order to encourage confidence and knowledge exchange, it is needed to organize pilots and demonstrations. Another key findings from our projects was that stakeholders felt freight was someone else's problem or priority. So they didn't feel part of the problem or part of the system. They didn't feel as a component. So it is important to understand how to make them feel they have an active role instead in the process. It would also be important understanding who should be responsible to define a regional governance on freight decarbonization, and how to engage at the regional scale how to engage more with professional bodies and smaller companies. Next slide, please. In terms of decarbonization policy process priorities, we believe that stakeholders' engagement is not broad and deep, but committed pockets do exist. We found that the regional level was relevant for stakeholder engagement in respect of specific flows or modes or responsibilities. However, it is important to have national-led targets and incentives if we really want to decarbonize freight and if we want it to be a priority. This would include also a nationally coordinated infrastructure plan of investments. Finally, carbon pricing can be a solution to drive freight decarbonization, but it is important to understand how this would be implemented and what would be social justice of carbon pricing with citizens, assuming the costs are passed on. Yeah, thank you. So where are the end consumers in this debate? We already said we completely missed end consumers because it was hard to engage with them, but it would be great to understand what kind of role they might play within the freight decarbonization, and what amount of carbon production are they responsible for when they make a choice, when they buy products. And this is why we have organized this workshop today.